Okay, so it looks like everything is good to go on our YouTube live streaming channel. So it looks like everything is good to go on our YouTube live streaming channel. I apologize for the feedback. That should be better. So Laura Fried, it looks like everything is good to go on our end. So when you'd like to begin the meeting, you may.
Okay, thank you. It is 10 o'clock precisely by the clock on my computer monitor. So I will call the subcommittee of the Public Employees Benefits Program Board to order. And we will go straight into it. Agenda item 1, roll call.
Laura Fried,
After I unmute myself. Here.
I guess. Michelle Kelly.
Here.
Betsy Aiello.
Here.
Tim Lindley.
Present.
And that's
Okay. Thank you. We have quorum. All right. Agenda item 2, public comment. I'll turn it back to PEB staff to put forth public comment. And just a reminder, as per usual, public comment we cannot take any action on a matter raised under public comment unless it's included on a future agenda item. And public comments to the board are always taken under advisement but may not be answered. And I think I'll limit it to 4 to 5 minutes per commenter. So with that, I'll turn it back over to staff.
Thank you. And as a reminder, the Zoom phone number is for public comment only. This meeting is streaming live on YouTube. To listen to the PEB board meeting, please access the YouTube link located on the agenda. For those of you who have called in during this period for public comment, the last 3 digits of the phone number will be announced and advised that the phone line has been unmuted, at which an audible message from Zoom will say that you are unmuted and press *6 to unmute. After the caller has unmuted themselves, they may proceed with their comments. So for the first phone number for public comment, we have phone number ending in 404. You are unmuted.
Good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Yes. Good morning, Chairwoman Freed and committee members. My name is Kevin Ranth, representing AFSCME Local 4041 active state employees. I'd first like to thank everyone for your hard work taking this audit seriously. State employees are extremely disappointed with the findings of the legislative audit. Numerous state employees are living paycheck to paycheck and look to get their best value from their benefits. As we know, legislative auditor found numerous concerns with the contract extensions and other areas during the period that our country and our state was on a financial uptick. These companies benefited and state employees did not. We will never know if they could have had real savings and improved benefits during these periods. That may be lost forever, but we hope they're not forgotten. I'd like to thank everyone for their time, as we are grateful PEB has taken steps to comply with the audit and making necessary changes to ensure this doesn't happen again. Policies clearly are going to be changed. People are not going to be held accountable, unfortunately. Some of those individuals are no longer with us. And for those reasons, we always call for further transparency to ensure that state employees receive the best value for their health benefits going forward. Again, we hope to see real savings for state employees in regards to your guys' decisions, and we appreciate your time and efforts you put into complying with the audit's request and making these changes today. Thank you.
Hello, this is Kent Irvin. Am I on?
Yes, we can hear you, Mr. Irvin. Please go ahead.
Hey, thank you very much. Good morning, Ms. Rich, Ms. Freed, and subcommittee members. Kent Irvin, ERVIN, with the Nevada Faculty Alliance. Having reviewed the legislative audit report and based on over 15 years of following PEB policies, I encourage the subcommittee to make meaningful changes in the Duties, Policies, and Procedures Manual to reinforce a change in the culture of PEB. Between 2015 and 2019, the manual was changed in ways that make the operations of PEB less transparent, and that has contributed to the valid criticism in the audit. Making PEB more transparent and accountable will improve PEB's standing with the legislature and with its members. I have submitted written comments and more details, but I would like to highlight a few issues. A major issue highlighted in the audit report is the perceived lack of oversight and involvement by the board itself in the awarding of contracts. In particular, they noted that the executive officer has been delegated the duties of the chief of the using agency under purchasing statutes, which are given to the board in NRS 287.04345. That delegation should be reversed. The board should restore decision-making authority over RFPs with prior approval of scopes of work and scoring weightings and approval of notices of intent to award contracts, and should only delegate the administrative duties to process them and negotiate terms. Next, the previous executive officer, or perhaps a previous board chair, apparently moved the responsibility for contract administration from the quality control officer, who reports to the board chair per NRS 287.0426, to staff members under executive officer's direct supervision. That should be reversed so that there is an independent line of reporting to the board about contracts, and to remove a conflict of interest when the executive officer is supervisor of evaluation committee members. That is the intent of the statute. The QCO's duties should be defined and in the manual. Another issue with the manual is that the prescription of the board policies for plan design and rate setting have been weakened and made more vague over the past 5 years. That leads to a lack of transparency, with policies changing over time without clear documentation, and also means that the new board members have no solid reference of what current policy is. The methodology should be specified in detail. A third party or a new executive officer should be able to reproduce the rate tables based on written policy and methodology. The record of board decisions should be documented directly by amendments to the manual rather than simple board motions as the primary source for board operations, plan design, rate setting, and employer contribution policies. Finally, in the past, the board played an active role in monitoring the program through various quarterly reports that are now on consent agendas. At least annually, those reports should be explained and reviewed in detail by the board. Thank you for this opportunity to comment, and thank you for your consideration of these issues to improve the program and address the serious issues in the legislative audit. Thank you.
Line ending in 237, you have been unmuted. Madam Chair, the public comment has been completed.
Okay, thank you very much. With that, we will move on to agenda item 3, discussion and possible action on changes to board policies and procedures related to PEB's corrective action plan submitted to the LCB Audit Division. Subcommittee members, you've had a chance to read, and of course we had a presentation about the audit at a past full board meeting, and you've had a chance to read the audit, and you've had a chance to read the corrective action plan dated November 28th that PEB staff sent. So I don't know if the executive officer wants to talk about what practical steps for amending the board policies and procedures we can take to implement the corrective actions on these recommendations, or the objective was to brainstorm practical solutions. So Executive Officer Rich, do you have any thoughts on that?
Sure. For the record, Laura Rich. The reason that there is no board report associated with this is because I think the intent, and if you read the audit, it's very clear that the auditors felt the need for the board to be more involved in these processes and to establish what it is that the board would like, and it benchmarks and guidelines for staff. And so I didn't think it was appropriate for staff to come and say, this is what we think the board should do. So it was left open for the board members to have, or the subcommittee to have kind of an open discussion. However, I did invite Kevin Doty. He is the administrator of purchasing, who I've had some conversations with, and I feel may have some information at least to provide to the board as far as the recommendations or the corrective action plan related to the contracts, which is the majority of those recommendations that were that are in that corrective action plan. So I don't know, Kevin, if you want to maybe just kind of kick it off with your thoughts and maybe opinions on actions that the board should or could take, or where that the board should start their conversations.
Thank you, Laura. Kevin Doty for the record. I'm the administrator for state purchasing. Yes, I've read the LCB's audit and the corrective action plan. And I don't think there's anything that's unusual in what I see here. I mean, this is the kind of problems I can see an agency getting into as far as, in a certain sense, relying upon solicitation waivers to extend contracts is an easy button that agencies too often push. It is, and oftentimes in each individual circumstance, it is done, may be done with the best of intentions, the idea that they actually are achieving best value for the state. But with the LCB audit coming in and seeing, the entire forest and not just each individual tree, each individual contract and solicitation waiver, it was obvious that tens of millions of dollars in contracts were awarded or extended without the benefit of an RFP. And it is the policy of the state of Nevada that the general policy of the Board of Examiners that contracts be solicited at least every 4 years. And I think that is a starting point for the board to look at, keeping tabs on how contracts are being put in place, and knowing that if an RFP is being done, then the assumption is that is the right way to do it. Extra scrutiny should be applied whenever something is done that isn't part of an RFP process. And I guess beyond that, my recommendation would be it might be worthwhile considering having a standing item on the PEB board meeting agenda regarding contracts, so that there can always be an update regarding where PEB staff is in the different contracting process. Many of the difficulties I see that agencies get into come from a lack of planning. It's important to know that RFPs can't be pulled off overnight. They require a lot of work, and they need to be drafted and redrafted and done with the help of subject matter experts who know exactly what you're looking for. And you have to put together an evaluation committee of experts, and it's a lot of work, and you have to allow time for that process to play out, plus the time to negotiate contracts after there's been an award, and then finally BOE approval, which takes some time in itself. So even if it's simply a matter of maintaining all of PEB's contracts on a spreadsheet and where they are in the different process, and I know that for the next couple of years, that will be a little hectic, since there is currently a lot of RFPs in the pipeline for PEB, and just causing a lot of work for PEB staff. And so it will be probably a couple of years before you're in a position where you can return to what we would call normalcy with regard to managing contracts. But just off the top of my head, those are the things that come to mind, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Doty. So subcommittee members, essentially, we're talking about recommendations 3, 4, and 5. We can return to recommendation 2 about gifting policies maybe in a bit, but since we have the purchasing administrator with us, I wanted to ask his opinion on, clearly, you know, the state administrative manual says contracts should be bid at least every 4 years, and we need to adhere to that. What is an appropriate term of a contract for these really large dollar contracts that PEB enters into, that something like a Medicaid would enter into, where transition of vast amounts of database information become necessary? And so what's the best practice for PEB in terms of negotiating lives, terms of contracts, and periodicity for bidding?
Yes, like I said, it's the general policy of the Board of Examiners that contracts be resolicited every 4 years. That isn't an absolute. And as you correctly pointed out, Chair Freed, there are very good reasons to go beyond 4 years. And the state has, for instance, with our Smart 21 contracts, those are 10-year contracts for the replacement of our HR and financial systems. We are working on an RFP right now for Medicaid that will probably be a 10-year contract. So if we have justification to go longer than 4 years, then we can do that. And so there may be differences in the different contracts PEB has. Some may need to go longer than 4. Other times it's possible to do a contract for, say, 4 years and then build in the possibility for 1 or 2 years of renewal. And the renewal will be based upon what market conditions are at that point and looking at what best value is. One of the downsides to that is sometimes in that situation, agencies will just assume that 2 years are a given and not look seriously at whether a new RFP should be done. But certainly 4 years is a guideline, and it's a guideline in both directions. If PEB were to get 1.5 years into a 4-year contract and decide that the contract wasn't working for PEB, then it could be useful to start putting together another RFP ahead of schedule and go out to bid early, if that was what the PEB board decided was best. And likewise, there are going to be contracts where it is in the best interest of PEB and the state of Nevada for the contracts to be initially put into place for a period longer than 4 years.
Okay. So, you know, and I'll throw this out to the subcommittee to chew on. My own feeling is that, I mean, for instance, the auditor's contract, you know, I know we have to go out to bid to replace Bob Carr and health claim auditors. That could be done every 4 years. The actuary, that could be done every 4 years, because there's obviously competitors in the market, and it behooves us to seek best value on stuff like that. I'm thinking more of the enrollment and eligibility system, the provider network contracts, the big stuff that we'd want to do for maybe 6 or 8 years. What appetite does the subcommittee have for getting into that kind of specificity in the policies and procedures? In other words, listing out all of our major vendors and saying the policy of the board is to rebid this, well, to rebid everything at least every 4 years, but these larger contracts, we would seek a term longer than 4 years. How does everybody feel about that?
This is Betsy, and I have a little bit of opinion. I worked at Medicaid for 17 years, and they may be doing a 10-year contract now, but we did manage to pull off during the time I was there every 4 years with large contracts, but it was outrageously hard, and we had to start drafting them after 2 years. So I'm not suggesting that that was best practice either, but I like the auditor's suggestion that maybe our policies and procedures use 4 years as a standard, and we develop a checkoff sheet that has the requirements, and probably purchasing already has one that maybe can be brought to us and we might make some tweaks, but that then there's the suggestion in our policy or the exception that management can deviate from this with documented reasons why. And then it would be in the record so that if we would know that the standard was X, but management has come to the board and suggested for X contract for this period, they're wanting an exception because of X, Y, and Z, and then it's approved and it's documented. Because I really liked a lot of the suggestions as being part of the policies, but that you could deviate. During the time I was there, we had a large HMO that probably had 120,000, maybe not that many, maybe 50,000. Because I think it was a new one that said after a year and a half, we can't do it for this money you're paying us. You need to give us more. And we said we can't. And they ended the contract. And we needed a way to scramble. And so there are times that you need to have exceptions, even outside the voted in exception. If someone says they're going to walk, you know, but so I like the idea where it says that we develop a checkoff list that gets for every contract submitted to the board, what was done to meet this requirement. And like I said, Mr. Dottie, probably purchasing has a generic one for RFPs, or maybe not.
Thank you for the question. If the question is about going beyond 4 years.
Not just to that. It's a checkoff list that says this RFP or this contract meets state law because we did state law X, we did this, state law Y. We did have something like that at Medicaid that we had to submit to our DAGs. And I don't know, we couldn't do anything without them saying, okay. And so we had a contract checkoff list before we released our RFP, that everything in the RFP was that way, that the timelines were that way, whatever it is that needs to be. Because I could say this audit found 4 things. So we adapt our policy for these 4 things. But maybe there's 3 others then that they'll pull the next audit. So we need to have a comprehensive checklist, I think. Whether it's a small contract, the checklist would be easy to sign. It's in RFP item 1.3.8 meets this requirement or whatever. And then it could be go to the board and the board could know that this meets the requirement and this contract does. But then if there's a requirement number 5 that PEB doesn't feel, maybe that's the length of the contract, or maybe that's some sort of insurance that the vendor has to cover and we think it needs to be waived for some whatever it may be, this item is waived because, or the PEB agency is asking us as a board to waive that item. So that's my thought, is that because as expert as we can be on RFPs, because we've done them for years and years and years, not all the board has done them. And each year I get a little bit older and a little bit farther away from having done certain things and a little bit more forgetful. And so that's where some of these requirements on forms would be helpful to me. Just a thought.
So it's Michelle Kelly here. So, when I think about PEBP contracting, I think it's obviously one of the most important things the agency does, right? Everything, all the rate setting, the plan design is based on the value we can get from our contracts. And so I think I do agree with the chair. I think that I think that the policy and procedures are very general at the moment. And I think that there needs to be more specificity across all of the items, not just the contracting, firstly, but we're talking about contracting today. And I also think that there's a benefit for, especially our more complex contracts, they tend to have the highest dollar value. And so I think that by having a are longer than 4 years up front, like if the plan is to maybe allow 6 or 8 year contracts, then let's bid it like that, because there's value in that length, right, for the vendors. So I do think that the board should identify those high value, complex, where it's in everyone's best interest to go for the longer term. I mean, we can always cancel them out, right? There's generally a 30-day notice period, or for health insurance, it's 60 or 6 months, whatever. So for non-performers, we can get them out. But I think perhaps the value, and I don't think there's a lot of those ones. Like, I do agree, the networks are important because they obviously impact our employees. We don't want those particularly turning over every 4 years, because there's always disruption and our employees go crazy about that disruption, rightly so. So I think identifying that and listing it in the policy, and having the checklist. The checklist is a great idea. And maybe as a board, for that oversight piece, we as a board need to be reviewing every contract every year with the checklist, right? To make sure the vendors are performing, we're still getting value, our employees are satisfied, all of the different items that go into, a successful contract. So I think that, so basically I'm agreeing that we need to have more detail. We should identify those high values where we want to go longer. And the default should be 4 years, and I think that a lot of them, as the chair said, fall into that 4-year category. So I also think, kind of stepping back a bit, I also think that the language in the policy really does need to be more specific, even as far as requiring that board members be on those RFPs. It doesn't even say that. It says maybe a board member or members will be on the committee. So we need to be more specific. And I also would like to see a timeline built into this policy. So right now, it's so general, but I'd like to, obviously it's not a timeline with designated dates or anything, but what is the order that the RFPs happen in, and who's responsible? When does it come back to the board? Basically a bullet point of how the entire process from start to finish, with the board oversight built in there before the contract's awarded, before that notice of intent goes out. The board needs to be approving the selection of vendor, right? I mean, that's our job. And then giving the executive officer or the quality control officer the power to start those negotiations for a better deal, or the best deal possible. My 150 cents.
Can I just interject here for a minute on that, on the last comment? This is Laura Rich for the record. So we ran into a problem, and Michelle, this is before you were on the board, but we ran into a problem several years ago when, and it was, we actually had to make changes to legislation because of this, where we had an evaluation committee make a decision, and then it went back to the board, and the board did not agree with that decision that was made. And so anyway, it long story short, it contradicted purchasing statutes. And so that process contradicted purchasing statutes, and we had to go back and make changes to our own statutes so that that didn't happen, so that we have an evaluation committee that essentially chooses who that winning vendor. And then at that point, a notice of intent goes out, which does give the executive officer and PEB the ability to start those negotiations. But if we revert back to that, it could cause potential problems because it's essentially in conflict with NRS 333. And I don't know, Kevin, if you want to add anything to that.
Sure, Laura, thanks. Basically, we don't want to be in a position where the evaluation committee's selection of a vendor from the winning proposals is somehow contradicted by a political decision or anyone who is in a position to, we don't want members of the board being subject to lobbyists or anything like that trying to overturn what an evaluation committee has decided. That is why we do need to stick with what the evaluation committee, their initial choice. If for some reason it's not possible to complete negotiations with that vendor, then it is possible to move on to the next highest scoring vendor in a solicitation. But I think what Laura was talking about was, trying to make sure the process is politically insulated. That is how our evaluation process is established under Chapter 333.
And this is Betsy. I just want to support those answers. Having been on some rather large evaluation committees, you may get binders that the evaluation committee may have spent 80 hours reviewing the submissions from all the different vendors or more as an individual at your house. Then you go to evaluation committee meetings, which can last up to 40 hours. So there's a lot of background in the choice that a board would never have all the knowledge. And that's where I could see the requirement or recommendation that a board member sit on one of the evaluation committees to represent the board. But there's a huge amount of work that nobody on a board could know that goes in for the choice. So
I think I understand all those points, and I don't disagree. But I think that there clearly is a conflict in both the NRS 333 and the auditor's report, because the auditor's report says the board is ultimately responsible. But the process that's outlined here basically delegates that responsibility to the executive officer, but also the committee. If the board basically, and I'm not saying that the board should review all of the finalists or should even revisit the scoring. I guess what I'm saying is that before the letter of intent is issued in that closed confidential meeting, the chair of the RFP committee should present the findings, including just the scoring on the finalists, and perhaps, all of the highlights of the contract. Because at the moment, it feels to me that when it comes to the board, it's fait accompli. How are we meant to perform our fiduciary duties if we're getting handed something with a bow and there's no alternative? So I'm not presuming that we would second guess scoring, because I've obviously been on those RFPs. There's a lot of documents to review and there's a lot of people to talk to. But I do think that I feel like the board can do its fiduciary duty and be satisfied with the outcome without getting into the political sphere. I think that was done for years and years. It's only in recent advents that there's been lobbyists out there at all the meetings and second guessing decisions. My intent is not because I think decisions need to be second guessed, but I do think that ultimately the NRS says where the board is responsible. And so how do we ensure that we are doing due diligence that's appropriate for the size of the contracts?
So what if we put into the policies and procedures that, depending on the size of the value of the contract, one or more board members need to sit on the review committee?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I mean,
Okay.
even aside from this conversation, I think there does need to be board representation on the committee. It's clear.
Yeah, and Laura Rich has done that in all the RFPs that are pending. At least one of us, and more likely two of us, are on those committees, which is, I think, a good thing. So we can certainly put that into the policies and procedures, because you're right. I mean, subcommittee members, Member Kelly was talking about policies and procedures beginning on page 9 and it ends on page 10. It's a very short section right now. So, okay. What I am hearing is that we should work on tell me, member ALO, if I'm restating your comments, because I think they were incredibly valuable, and your experience as a retiree from HHS is really, really valuable. So we should have a checklist that staff needs to submit to the board if we're going to deviate from a typical 4-year RFP cycle.
Let me read what I wrote in my notes and see
Okay,
if
great.
this makes sense.
That's even better.
I would suggest a policy and procedure is needed to require contracts. This is almost what the auditors said. And contract amendments have supporting documentation showing compliance with state laws and policies and proper approvals before submission to BOE. And then I would suggest this would include a checklist that identifies this that could be submitted to the board, something along that line. And then I would like to see a policy and procedure that PEB management would need to provide documentation that would justify any deviation from the state policies and procedures or best practices that would then be submitted to the board. So in other words, if that checklist had an item that couldn't be checked because PEB was wanting to deviate from it, they would submit justification for that deviation. And then following with that, because purchasing gets to review everything and say it's a go or it's not a go, that there needs to be a PMP that requires purchasing approval for any amendments or contract extensions that are above a certain level, and purchasing could probably guide us on this, because you may not release an RFP. You may just want to do a contract extension, but at a certain point it should go to purchasing through the board, but to purchasing. But we need to know where in our policies that needs to occur, unless it's 100% of them. And maybe that if it meets certain checklist things, purchasing just stamps it. I mean, I'm not big for total bureaucracy, but sometimes when you dial things back, you have to get tighter again before you can loosen them.
Those are all great ideas, but let me play devil's advocate here for a second. One of the things that got the past executive officer, called out in this audit was $0 scope changes that purchasing would never see. And that's where the board comes into play, because it turns out some of those scope changes, which just go straight to the clerk of the Board of Examiners because they're $0, that was the stuff that didn't get taken to the board for review and approval, and then it just went straight to GFO. And again, purchasing would have no insight into that. So
And
how do we deal with that kind of thing, where a $0 scope change might in fact be programmatically really substantive?
And maybe Kevin Doty or Dottie, I'm sorry, could address, it was my understanding that with most contracts, you can't make a scope change because vendors didn't have the ability. You could make an extension maybe, and with the extension, it might add more dollars, but I thought that a substantive scope change was not allowed under NRS at all, from my understanding, because other vendors didn't get the chance to tell you what their options may have been, and maybe I'm wrong.
Thank you for the question. I think you hit upon exactly the right word there, in the word substantial. If you have a substantial change of scope, then it is something that we should really look at, possibly going out to bid for a new contract, possibly. Whereas if you're making changes within the scope of what was bid, which often happens, especially when you have a complicated contract, there are, especially if it involves IT components of any type, things come up. that need to be adjusted and changed along the way. And then it's appropriate to do a change in scope and make sure you get that all put in writing, because we'd much rather have the lawyers review changes like that and make sure things are put in writing in a contract, as opposed to just having a vendor say, oh yeah, we'll make that change for you. It's much better practice to make sure we go through the process of amending the contract to show that change is reflected in the contract.
And so maybe that, because the question then would be how, I think your question, Laura, was how would that get caught? And that might be the removal of the executive, that exception of the board to the executive officer, because if a contract change was requested to be being made that included a scope change, if the board members were aware in their policies and procedures, and in the audit report, I thought it was pretty clear. Actually, I even wrote in my notes that the United States GAO had some real good language about what requires a substantive scope change. I think it was in the audit report. And if that was somehow in the P&Ps for the board, then the board would all be educated to what's substantive versus not. If the board was, again, the chief, as NRS is requiring, then the onus would be on the board and the members of the board to catch it when a scope change. Some thoughts. I'll try to be a little quiet.
And this is Laura Rez for the record. I think that Betsy said she hit the nail on the head when it comes to the fact that we need to define substantive, because Kevin, I think you can probably agree with me here that in the past, these scope changes that were approved by the previous executive officer were considered in at the time by him and also by the previous purchasing administrator to not be substantive, and which is why it was the audit finding. It was in the audit finding, but when it actually happened, it made it through the process, because that definition of what is substantive it never existed. And so I think that that's something that is necessary in this case.
So it's Michelle here. I think I agree with a lot of what Betsy's saying, but, I also oversee and have in the past large RFPs, and we don't want to make it too bureaucratic, right? I mean, I think that is I have some concerns. I think that, yes, we need to define what substantive is, but that is almost contract dependent, right? I mean, I think that you have to start at the beginning. You have to start at, firstly, the board needs to be responsible for developing the scope of work. I feel like in the past few years under the former executive officer, maybe the desire was to keep the board out of as much as possible. And as an administrator, I can see the value of getting the board out of as much business as you can. But the reality is that the board is responsible. The NRS outlines what the board's responsible for, and it's everything, right? And a lot of it's delegated to the executive officer, but I don't really think contracts should be delegated in any way. Because I do think that, as I've said, I think it's one of the largest things we do as a board, and it needs to be transparent, and there does need to be input. So I personally think that I agree with Betsy that the delegation to the executive officer needs to be removed. I think that the board itself needs to approve all of the scope of works for any and all contracts, and that can be done. Long before the RFP goes out. Like, these contracts don't change a whole lot from time to time. It's a fairly stable thing. And I understand new technology maybe changes the scope of work. That then comes back to the board, and that would actually educate the board, so that when there is a scope change, people understand what you're talking about. Because I think that I mean, we've talked about the different knowledge levels of the board members. So part of educating them is kind of reviewing all of that material on a fairly regular basis. So I think that, I think the board needs to take back responsibility. It needs to be really clear in the procedure process. I do think that we can, for those contracts that are more complex and high dollar value, we can justify upfront why they're more than 4 years, right? I mean, we can go through the high value or the complex with assistance from staff and go, okay, well, this is high value, it's complicated. What are the pros and cons of going for 6 or 8 or whatever we want to talk about, and actually document that in advance. And then we don't have to do it every time, and we don't have to burden purchasing every time kind of we go out or there's a change. We don't have to kind of go to them and say, well, this is why we're doing it. Let's do it up front, because I think that allows more input from the public too, right? So the board's responsible for the scope of work in my perfect world. And then, of course, there is the subcommittee that does its evaluating and its selection. And then it comes back to the board to present on the finalist, and that's when the contract's entered into. But I do think that, I just think that it feels like the board's kind of been sidelined from when I used to watch all the meetings. There used to be a lot of information given to the public, which was really helpful in understanding the decisions the board had to make. So I think I'm midway with Betsy and not, because I think that maybe there's too much bureaucracy if you really dig down deep, but we can do a lot of this work up front that's not repetitive.
Hey, Tim here, if I may chime in. All right, Tim, for the record. So we've kind of gone through a lot of topics, and I do have some notes on my end, and Kevin, you may have to chime in. Can you kind of, please understand I'm a new board member, newly appointed, and getting my feet wet and learning as much as I can, but can you tell me what a solicitation waiver is and what it does?
Certainly, Kevin Doty for the record. A solicitation waiver comes up in a couple of different circumstances. Essentially, it is the administrator of state purchasing determining that a RFP doesn't have to be done in a case where we have a sole source, for example, where there's only one vendor who can possibly do the work, or more often than not, agreeing to extend a contract beyond its original 4-year time frame. And that is done in order to adhere to the state's policy of best value. Oftentimes, I have to grant an extension for a certain amount of time because an agency simply doesn't have time to complete an RFP and get it done and get the contract approved, but before the one that is in place expires. But hopefully with good planning, that doesn't happen. That's basically what a solicitation waiver is.
Okay, so just kind of recapping what you said, it's typically done when there's one vendor out there, no other potential people out there, or wanting to extend the contract beyond 4 years, or an attempt to adhere to the policy of best value. My question to the director, Rich, would be, do we have any contracts where there is only one vendor who can possibly do the work?
That's not usually the case. Usually,
Okay.
with most of the contracts that we have, we definitely would go out to bid for. I can't think of one that would just have one vendor.
Okay, so I guess what I'm trying to understand is in the audit there were solicitation waivers, is that correct? And that they were used to extend contracts beyond the contract frame? All right. The 4-year time period is just a recommendation in the SAM, is that correct, Mr. Doty?
That is correct. It is the general policy of the Board of Examiners. The contracts should be resolicited at least every 4 years. The idea behind that is that we assume the competition is what will yield the best price for the state, the best value for the state. And if there are circumstances where it can be shown that best value can be achieved without that, then that is when a solicitation waiver is.
Kevin, you also noticed that there's a time to process, the RFP process, generating the RFP all the way to approval. What's the general time frame for approving a contract?
It's longer than most people think. And it depends entirely on the complexity of the contract. It can take a long time to get together a big RFP because it is important, as we heard in the earlier discussion, to make sure we have a good scope of work put in that RFP so the vendors know what it is what we're looking for. And then there is time for the evaluation committee to review the proposals and score them. And that's when we issue a letter of intent. And that starts contract negotiations with the vendor who was scored number one in the evaluation process. And what makes it difficult for me to put an exact timeline on the whole process is that contract negotiations are something that is oftentimes beyond our control. They can drag on quite a bit once the attorneys get involved. We have contracts that we have vendors who accept the state's conditions on day one and we just proceed. Other times it takes months of going back and forth. And there are situations where the attorneys simply can't agree and we have to decide to move on to the second highest scoring vendor because we simply can't come to a contract. But once we get to that point, that's when once we have contract terms agreed to, that's when we get to what we call the notice of award. And that's when a vendor who didn't win has the opportunity to file an appeal with our appeals division. And that could delay things further. If we don't have that, or we've got past that point, that's when we go to the Board of Examiners for approval. And that's usually with the kind of contracts we're talking about at PEB, that they're usually going to be a big enough dollar amount that's going to be full board approval. So that's going to be at least another 6 weeks.
So a quick question, is this on the internet, like the steps, RFP, is that all on the internet?
You should be able to find this information at our website for the purchasing division.
Yep, okay, I'm there.
And if you have any questions, you can always ask me.
But the whole process is online, okay. And as far as time frame, I guess Director Rich, what would you recommend? What would you say is our typical time frame for a normal, or just ballpark? You don't need to get specific.
So, well, I was actually going to provide you with a kind of an example and an illustration. So back in, I believe it was the May board meeting, we presented to the board, PEP presented to the board the request for a solicitation for the enrollment and eligibility system. That was very, very quickly developed. We really should have taken more time to do it, but we had a very, very small window of time to release it, knowing that the implementation for that was going to be a year long. That was back in May. We developed the solicitation that went out, and the committee met at the end of August, I believe, and decided on a winning vendor. In that time, we've negotiated the contract and done everything that that Kevin Doty just talked about, and it is now just up for the or it was just approved at BOE the other day. So I mean, we're now in December, and so that process was from May to December, and that's pretty normal for the most part. It's contracts do take, solicitations do take about 6 months from start to finish.
Okay, so one thing I've heard in the discussion was education. And probably one thing I'd like to see is in the board packet or the agenda, maybe just a hyperlink to the purchasing division's step-by-step process on how contracts are awarded. So then if someone asks, like Michelle said, we received a the number one bid wrapped in a bow, we know, or we can show, hey, this is the process on how we got it gift wrapped and put into a bow, because it's education at that point. Another thing is we were talking about time frame for contracts. 4 years is the recommended period. As an active member, and well, Mr. Doty, I'm an auditor for taxation, and as an auditor, the one thing I don't like is change, because when there's change, there's room for error. Or yeah, we don't like, I don't like change, because change shows problems or can reveal things that are not originally found, or you know what I'm saying, I hope. So for members and state employees who use the PEB contracts, such as HMO, the dental providers, or the PPO, or even the pharmacy network, there, I guess you could say that we don't want them to see a lot of change, because a lot of change in health insurance benefits tends to yield less confidence in the employer. And my idea would be to break out 2 categories of contracts. One would be signed kind of a front of the house contract, and the other one would be a back of the house contract. Back of the house contract, for example, would be the auditor. As an employee, I don't really know who the auditor is. I don't interact with the auditor. I don't have face with the auditor, but I do have face with my dental network, with my pharmacy benefits manager, because I'm going to go pay for my prescriptions. And so I would say that we throw out just my idea of spitballing here, the idea of saying, okay, if it's an administrative type contract or back of the house type contract, put it to a 4-year period. And if it's a front of the house contract, extend it to 6 or 8 years, or even 10 years, because then we can show our members, hey, we have longevity. We don't expect a lot of change. You have your doctor, you can keep your doctor, kind of thing. Those are my comments at this time.
Okay, it is 10:57. We've been at it for an hour. Would everyone like a couple of minutes break?
Yes, it's Michelle here. I do have a quick question for Mr. Doherty before we get off, in case he disappears. I wasn't sure if he was planning to go off.
Mr. Doty is not allowed to disappear. I'm sorry.
Okay, I'm fine with holding it then.
And Laura, I just wanted to bring up, I have a 1 o'clock meeting elsewhere, because this was posted 10 to noon.
Yeah.
I don't know if it'll go longer, because I can cancel the other meeting during the break if I need to.
This is, I don't know if that was directed at Laura Rich or Laura me, but I know my intention, I know this is an item for possible action. My intention is to take the discussion here and then have PEB staff kind of work on a red line version of the contract section of the policies and procedures. And then we'll have another meeting to discuss the kind of the ideas generated and how the red line looks and how we feel about that.
Okay, thank you. I won't cancel my next appointment.
Okay, sounds good. All right, so I'll see everybody in at 11:05. Okay, it is 11:06, so we'll call the subcommittee meeting back to order. Mr. Lindley wanted to, I think, had a few further comments, so I'll toss it to him.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to recap because we did step on a break. We recapped the solicitation waiver. And one quick question, Mr. Doty, that's done by the Board of Examiners?
It's done by me. I'm the
Okay.
solicitation waivers. We have a form on our website that gets filled out and submitted to me, and an agency can explain their justification for why they think a solicitation waiver is warranted.
Gotcha. And then a couple more questions. So the audit found that solicitation waivers were submitted, but it was at the recommendation of the prior director, but it did go through a secondary process. Is that correct?
Yes, and my understanding is that process is the executive officer of PEB would send the solicitation waiver over to the administrator of state purchasing, who would then sign it, and then the executive officer of PEB would attach that solicitation waiver to, say, a contract extension that was then submitted to the Board of Examiners.
Okay, so there's a lot of steps that took place for the solicitation waiver. All right. So kind of recapping, there is no requirement for 4 years. We can extend greater than 4 years for contracts. The contract renewal process is a very long process. My recommendation was to show members that we don't have a lot of change and possibly break up contracts into 2 or maybe 3 main categories. One category that has a direct impact on members and they have a longer term than the 4 years. And then a category that doesn't have a direct impact on members, like an administrative category, such as the auditor, for example, just spitballing here, that is 4 years. And my general thoughts is to keep it as simple as possible, because the more complex we get, the longer the approval process becomes. And instead of 6 months, we're looking into 8 months, 9 months, even a year for an approval process. And I don't want to wait a year or go through papers for a year to make a decision. Oh, and then add the purchasing divisions, like maybe the hyperlink to the agenda item for items that are presented to the board for approval. So then if a board member or a public has any questions, we can say, here's the hyperlink, please go to the state purchasing website. So then board members and public know this is a process. It's not just, here's one choice. It was thoroughly vetted by multiple people.
Mr. Doty, I just have a question for you regarding, I think it's NRS 333. It's my understanding that although the full board can't revisit the scoring as a whole that the evaluation committee does, the committee as a board can reject the bidder, right? For documented reasons. If the full board decided there was personnel issues or there was conflict, am I correct in thinking that the board could reject the highest scorer that the selection committee had selected? Can you talk a bit about that process, maybe rather than just yes, no?
Yes, I think there is unlike most agencies simply followed the process set forth in Chapter 333, and that's what we do. PEB has a specific statute regarding the role the board plays in the awarding of contracts. So that's something where you would have to. I would defer to whatever interpretation your DAG has of that statute regarding what the board's powers are, regarding accepting or rejecting a statute. Accepting or rejecting the recommendation of the evaluation committee, because it is slightly different than just how Chapter 333 applies to most other agencies.
Okay, thank you. Is Chairperson Freed, is our DAG DAG?
She is. Ms. Mooneyhan, take it away.
Thank you, Brandy Mooneyhan, for the record. I can look it up right now and let you know the exact site, but there is a statute in Chapter 287 that does allow the entire board to consider in a closed session the RFPs, the recommendation by the committee. For example, I think on your last board meeting, there was an agenda item that said, this may be closed for a small time for the board to discuss with the committee how the decision was made. So that is available to the PEB board.
Right. This is procurement process. This is page 9 of the P&Ps. Procurement process B4. The board shall review the results of any evaluation of proposals for a contract for the program pursuant to NRS 333, 335 in a closed meeting. And last meeting, we did not choose to go into closed session to discuss the scoring of that enrollment and eligibility RFP.
I guess so at my last meeting, it was my second meeting, and I personally didn't feel comfortable shutting down the meeting to go into closed session. So I would prefer that the board reviewing the details of that RFP not be optional. I think it should be required, even though it has to be closed. I think it should be part of our process, right? Because by us not reviewing it, we just kind of rubber stamped there was no information provided about that particular contract. So I think that, I think that the board should automatically have to close the meeting to review that, even if it's just for 5 minutes. But I think that the process should outline that that's required. I just have concerns about us some of this stuff being discretionary, because depending on your maturity on the board, depending on your knowledge as to whether you're going to, kind of follow the procedures or just follow what other people do. And I don't think we're in the business, we're in the business of making wise decisions for all of our population. And I'm just not sure that that's always just by rubber stamping stuff. So I would prefer that be a requirement.
And this is, Betsy, just one of the things that could occur if the board isn't comfortable with the regular RFP process. Having worked closely with administrators in the agency, they rarely changed anything in the RFP process, because large dollar contracts would most assuredly go into legal proceedings if an awarded and negotiated vendor. And so when you have things like medical networks or HMOs and things like that, and they get tied up, your current vendor would have to be willing to have an extension. And there's a lot of times computer programming and things. So potential board negative, if the board's not comfortable with what comes out of the RFP process, the negative consequences are huge. Just bringing this up, and would probably have to add some timeline in Medicaid for our medical ones. We had to start the RFP process year 2 of 4. So in a 4-year contract at year 2, we were releasing the RFP, because it would take the vendors almost 3 months to develop the proposals because they were extremely complex. And then once it was awarded, there were 3 to 6 months for computer programming, enrollment choices, turnover. So just to throw that out, I think it would be very problematic if the board ever rejected what had come through purchasing at the end of an RFP process. But I'm willing if other people wanted to do that, but.
No, I tend to agree with that. I think that would get us into litigation very quickly.
And then we would have
but it's also
solicitation
the worst
waivers
case
again.
scenario, right? I mean, it's personally, that is the worst case scenario. And I don't think the fear of that kind of litigation should prevent us from doing our job.
this is Betsy again. I think when you say you're going to do something at a certain process, then to not do, I mean, to do it, but then still quote unquote, rubber stamp or hold that is almost not doing it, and to put it in the policy you're going to. I don't know. It's scary to me to do that from my background and the legal things issues we used to deal with.
And I think that's the reason you'd have one or two, or depending on the size of the RFP, even 3 board members on the committee. I mean, you'd have the SMEs who, you know, and the board members may or may not, in fact, be SMEs, but they're there on the evaluation committee to protect the interests of the board, even if they don't have the niche expertise that other folks on the evaluation committee do. So if you take that into a closed meeting, you know, the people who were on the evaluation committee can speak freely to other board members about why the scoring is what it is.
And then that goes back to the checklist that I talked about. And when the contract comes to the board meeting, it indicates that all the legal steps were followed in a way, whether it's reviewing part of the RFP process. My understanding is reviewing the vendor for past breaches of contracts, personality conflicts, political, whatever it is. So if you have this checklist that says when it comes to the board, and if there's a section that wasn't done, then we require PEB to write up why it wasn't done. We're justifying we didn't do this one because of something. Then we could have confidence that everything that needed to be followed was followed.
Tim here, if I may chime in. I think to Michelle's point, and Brandy kind of answered it, the board reserves the right to close it and review the RFPs in more detail. Is that correct, Ms. Mooneyhan?
Yes, the way the statute is written is that the board can review the results of any, the scoring process, basically. You can do that in a closed meeting. And so the entire board can go ahead and review that. But then in the open meeting, of course, you can either award the contract or not, or choose to make changes to the RFP or whatever you desire.
And if we wanted to close it, would that have to be an agenda item, or could a board member just request it?
Well, generally the PEB does put it on the agenda that it may be closed. And I did look at the statute. It's NRS 287.04345. It does alert the public that it may be closed to consider that. And of course, a board member can do that. Or if you did want to make it a policy that you always closed it for that, you could do that. It's just the way the agenda item is written is to alert the public as to what may or may not happen.
So it's pretty much already there, and I think that would answer your question, Ms. Kelly. It doesn't necessarily have to be a policy and procedure because it's already notified to the public. And Ms. Moynihan, if Ms. Kelly or I want to close the meeting, we would just say, can we review the RFP in more detail? We'd go from there, or of course with a little bit of advance notice.
Right. And I do, PEB does usually set up the agenda items to that effect to kind of alert the board and the public that this may be closed to consider the RFPs. I mean, to consider the way they were evaluated.
Ms. Mooneyhan, I just have another question around the timing of that meeting. So at the last meeting, the RFP that came to us after the letter of intent was issued. So the letter of intent is basically the decision's been made, and yet the board didn't really review that decision until so I'm just confused about the timing. It's my understanding that in fact that can come to the board before the letter of intent is issued because it's closed, it's confidential, right? We're not going to talk about anything in public session that that would breach that confidentiality.
Right. The statute does not dictate the timing on that, so you could do that earlier in the process if you so desired.
This is Laura. So Michelle, in that situation, the letter of intent and Kevin can correct me if I'm wrong, but the letter of intent basically just is, it's the letter that notifies the vendor that we intend to contract with them, but it opens the door for negotiations. And that's all it is. It's a notification to the vendor saying the evaluation committee picked you, the door is now open to start those contract negotiations, but the award does not happen until after those contract negotiations have taken place.
Laura, Rich,
That is
adding to
correct.
that,
Yes.
adding to that, contract negotiations can still fail. So my understanding is the letter of intent is just, yeah, it's just opening the door. It's not full commitment. We're not married to the contract. Is that correct?
From a legal perspective, the timing's just interesting to me, right? I mean, if we're ultimately responsible, if the board is ultimately responsible, then surely the board should be doing its due diligence before that letter of intent goes out.
If I may, I think one of the issues we have is has to do with compliance with Chapter 333. Our confidentiality provisions apply from the moment we issue the RFP until notice of award. So that's when the contents of the proposals submitted in response to the RFP are kept confidential under Chapter 333. So that's only the evaluator should be seeing the proposals at that point. The evaluators and the purchasing officer who's running the solicitation should be seeing the proposals from the moment that they're submitted until there is a notice of award issued. So that could be one of the issues here. So I think it's the board will probably need to put extra effort into making sure the scope and the RFP are exactly the way you want them before the RFP is issued, because that's the time to make changes to the RFP, is before we put it out on the street, before vendors submit proposals. And then when the board goes into session to review a notice of award and make a decision on whether to award a contract or not, I think it would create legal problems if the board decided that they would rather choose one vendor over another. But if the board looked at what was being awarded as a contract and came to the conclusion that, well, this doesn't meet the board's needs, then that would be a situation where we would look at, and as painful as it might be, if we get to that stage and we don't actually meet the needs, that means that the RFP probably wasn't written correctly, and we may need to cancel and restart the process with a new RFP. But those are just some of the rules we have to deal with in Chapter 333.
Okay, so then it's your rule, and that's okay. Like, it's purchasing's rule that that not come to the board before that letter of intent. That's kind of what I heard in a nutshell.
Yes,
or your recommendation.
Yes, it has to do with our confidentiality requirements under Chapter 333.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Tim here, piggybacking off that. So we can chime in on the RFP process, is that correct? Before the RFP is sent out, on drafting the RFPs?
Absolutely. The more people who add constructive criticism and help in the development of an RFP, that's a good thing. We want to have a lot of effort put into drafting the RFP and making sure the outcome of this process is something that is what PEB needs. Because as we talked about, this is a lengthy process. That is why it makes sense to invest time up front in making sure you have an RFP and particularly a scope of work in that RFP that will yield what you want at the end of the lengthy process.
So the members of this subcommittee came in after the fact, but at least with this last round of RFPs, I personally reached out to all of the board members and asked, one, if they would like to be evaluators, and two, if they would like to participate in the development of that RFP. And we did have board members who provided their input and feedback on those RFPs before they were put out on the street. So that's something, Michelle, I could put that also into the policies and procedures, that not only would board members be approached for to be evaluators, but also to be part of that development process of those solicitations.
So I'm just really, this development of the solicitation is the scope of work, right? I mean, that's the most important piece of any RFP. So under the process you've followed, Ms. Rich, are those coming to the board, or are you saying only the people who agree to be on the committee are getting to review those scopes of work?
So in practice, what we have been doing is I have reached out to the board members and have asked, would you like to be a part of any of these solicitations? If board members did respond and say, yes, I would like to be a part of, either specific ones or, just assign me to one. At that point, then they're given access to the RFP, and not only does PEB staff provide their input and feedback, but the PEB board members also have provided input and feedback as well. No, it has not gone to the board for final approval. However, I caution that because while it's great, it's a good idea, it really adds on a lot of time to a solicitation. You've already heard that an average solicitation can take 6 months. I would probably add, another 4 months onto that, because the board meets every other month, and there would possibly be, it would bring it back. Those solicitations would definitely start taking a lot longer. And I'm not opposed to that, but I'm just saying that, now we're going to have to start looking at solicitations way in advance.
Sorry, it's Michelle here. So what I see is that PEBP currently has 16 contracts, which is a lot. There's no doubt about it. I think the beauty of, if you want to look at the bright side of the audit report, is we're having an opportunity to look at the processes, right? And it would be my hope that out of this process, the subcommittee and then the board considering it, that we actually come up with a calendar whereby we know that, you've issued 6 RFPs this year. So we've got the start date on each of these RFPs, and that we develop a full calendar for all of these contracts that stagger it, so that you never have to do 6 big ones in a year again, right? So if we have a calendar developed such as that says, this contract goes out, every 6 years or whatever, we can actually put the year it's going to go out. And that builds time in for that scope of work to be considered at a board meeting. And the reason I keep coming back to that is that's the public's opportunity to also see how some of the sausage is made, right? I mean, that's their opportunity to see, what does this contract actually do? What's involved in the eligibility system? And the scope of, not everyone wants that level of detail. And certainly, they're generally, would be comments, but hopefully not too many changes. But I do think that that's the opportunity for more transparency. And so I'm a proponent of actually building that calendar out, building in the opportunity for the full board to, at least as an information item, more as an action item though, to review the scope of work for any comments before it's actually released, rather than just the subset.
May I ask a question, Mr. Doty? Is there a problem if a contract scope of work is reviewed at public meetings before it actually drops, and or if PEB would change? Because I know that the contracts we would release were highly confidential till they dropped, so there would be no vendor got knowledge ahead of another vendor, and or if it went through a public meeting, then if there was a change, even if it was based, someone identified a law wasn't followed in it or something, would that be problematic? Or because it was changed for everybody, it wouldn't? I don't know, just a question.
That's an excellent point. I think that's one of the reasons why PEB has the specific statute that allows it to go into closed session to discuss an RFP, not just the notice of award, but the RFP itself. We try to keep RFPs and the contents of the RFPs confidential until they're released, because we want to maintain a level playing field. We don't want one vendor seeing the RFP before another, because it is a window of time that each vendor gets to propose in response to an RFP. And particularly with many of these PEB contracts, they are quite complicated. And it takes a lot of effort to put together a good proposal in response to one of these RFPs. So we want to make sure we don't, accidentally favor one vendor over another in that process. So the RFP discussion could be in closed session also to meet that. And that's where because I know we never let nobody could talk. Once we were writing RFPs, oh my gosh, you couldn't say a word. Yes, and there's another good reason for why you want that discussion about what goes into the scope to be probably held in a closed hearing. Anything you say in an open hearing, any attorney who represents an unsuccessful bidder later will try to use that to their advantage in a potential lawsuit. Say, well, they considered this, they didn't consider that. That's why this RFP wasn't done correctly, and so forth. So I think that's one of the reasons why that provision for a closed meeting for RFP discussions is included in your law.
Tim here. I wanted to kind of bring it back to improvements with policies and procedures. Are we allowed, or is the executive director's presentation allowed to say, okay, in the next 2 years, these are the contracts coming up?
Absolutely.
I would like that. I mean, just keeps us more informed.
Right. That is actually, she's actually put that into her executive officer report, not last board meeting, but I think the one previous. So I think what we'll do, since we're it is 11:30 and I know member ALO has a meeting at 1, I want to sort of bring the conversation back to specific edits or specific draft edits, I should say, to the contract section of the policies and procedures. So to your point, Mr. Lindley, I think, and to Mr. Doty's suggestion really early in this meeting, that we have just a standing board item on contracts. I think we should add that in to the policies and procedures. And that would be the opportune time for the executive officer to sort of provide us the calendar of all the contracts we have, where they are in their terms, when we should be rebidding them, and what kind of time frame that's going to be, especially if we're going to go into closed session to discuss an RFP or a scope of work. So that's one thing. On B2, the board shall act as the chief of the using agency for the purposes of NRS 333, 335. I think this is a good spot to incorporate your ideas about front of the house, public facing contracts, and back of the house, auditor, janitor, stuff like that, doesn't affect the participants particularly much. It would be something like the board shall act, the board delegates the role as chief of the using agency to the executive officer in the following cases. You know what I mean? And then
Why are we delegating that, executive officer? I don't understand why we're delegating it. That was a big criticism out of the audit report.
Because how much time does the board want to spend on contracts that are pretty small in the grand scheme of things? Like, I would never delegate to the executive officer a health or dental network. but I would delegate, like I said, the auditing contract for 4 years, or, the basic, because we could get really into the weeds. I mean, does the board really want to know about the copier leases in the PEB office? I mean, that's a contract. Does the board want to know who the janitorial service is? That's a contract that has to go to the Board of Examiners. I mean, so you're talking, the essential question is, where does the board want to draw the line about what it wants to spend board meeting time on?
Betsy, I have a question though, but that's part of what the audit did hit, was that some of those contracts were extended when maybe they shouldn't have been, or some, especially like the actuary and the audit, I think, because they are a little higher value than the couple of the others that you did say. And so that's where I liked the idea of the checkoff. Maybe the board would retain being the chief, but the board itself would not get into the weeds in them, because they would just approve those based on some of those things, where the other contracts, of course, that may depend on who the board is. But I know that the audit did hit some of those that might be considered back office, because they still are high dollar, because auditors and actuaries are not cheap.
Right. So we could determine a dollar value that we would delegate to the executive officer and the executive staff of PEB, or we could go ahead.
I would probably say if it's de minimis, less than de minimis established at 10%. If it's less than 10% of our total expense, it's probably below threshold for board review. We can delegate that.
With PEB's budget, that could be fairly high.
Yeah.
Just
that would actually, yeah, right. I mean,
10%.
I mean,
it would be huge.
I think you might mean 10% excluding the claims categories.
There you go. Yeah.
Okay.
I would suggest that maybe not the dollar amount, but if it impacts the plan. So I think janitorial, copier, they have an indirect relationship with the plan.
So back of the house.
Administrative function. But if it's because I think actually reviewing our auditors is important, right? We trust them. The board should be looking at the auditors, because, I mean, way before my time, when I was a baby, I remember coming to PEBP meetings and hearing about how the auditor had basically led the plan into a place where we had to get a bailout from the state government, and the government was not happy about that. And for my first 10 years in my job with Nevada, I kept hearing about the auditor. So audit is actually really important, even though it's not a big number, right? So I think that if it impacts the plan, if it impacts participants, if it impacts our pricing of the plan, we should be looking at the RFPs.
So let me ask this. If we were to remove that, the board delegates the role as the chief, then when a contract was coming up, could the board not one-on-one vote that contract could be delegated as the board wanted to, but wouldn't it have to be listed ahead? Just throwing that out.
I think that would be a great compromise to, that at those regular contract discussions, the executive officer puts the contract up and says, this is the pros of us just handling this, and the committee can decide to delegate.
That kind of adds on to what I was thinking, like 2 categories. You can even say 3 categories of contracts. The janitorial contract category, I don't really want to see and weigh in on the janitorial contracts or the copy machines. And then so I would say that's far back of the house. And then there's back of the house, such as the auditor. And then there's front of the house, such as the Health Plan of Nevada, for example. I mean, the first tier we don't see, because I don't really care who cleans the offices. Second contract, we kind of see a bit more detail, but the third contract, we definitely delve into a bit more. Just spitballing here.
Okay, I think that gives the staff something to work on a red line version with. I also, and I won't suggest where it might be good, but I do hope they can work in member ALO's suggestion of a checkoff list and language regarding, and I think this could be under like a standing contracts item, you know, a discussion and possible action of, you know, any, and in fact, you know what, I would suggest adding a subsection C. We've got procurement process, and then I think we should probably break out amendment process in a specific subsection, and then we can, you know, then the staff can suggest language around, you know, an amendment that substantively changes the scope, and then we can incorporate that discussion that we had previously about the definition of what a substantive scope change is that the board needs to weigh in on.
And just throwing out again for Laura Rich, they did in the audit report have the GAO definition of scope of change on page 27 as 64. So at least it's a federally accepted definition. You may want to make adjustments, but it might be easier if you look there.
So is the suggestion then to use that definition?
I'm always for ease, but if there's something in it that really doesn't work for you, I'm fine if you want to bring back some slight amendments to it, but use it as a start. I don't feel like I need to dictate exactly to you guys.
And the only other, oh, go ahead, Laura.
So just for clarification, I think we talked about board members being required to be part of the evaluation committee and possibly the development of a solicitation. Is that the general consensus? Because, and I'll just tell you from not prior to my time, but I know with the previous executive officer in different makeups of the board, there's always been by PEB staff, the board members have always been given the opportunity to participate. They just have not always had the time, or they felt that they didn't have the expertise, or, you know, whatever their reason may be, they did not. We did not have any board members who chose to participate. And so if we make that a requirement, that really does put a burden on the board members. So I just want to make sure that that's something that everyone understands.
Laura, Tim here. I would say when we do the contract review, like, hey, these are the contracts coming up in 2 years, board members, you know, that's the time when you invite board members to, you know, participate, or as a reminder, because we have a lot on our plates, obviously, and we could tend to forget. But in an open meeting like that, it kind of, you've already given us notice.
And you could also use, sorry, it's Michelle for the record. So you could also use the chart that Tim suggested with the back of the house, the back of PEB, and then the front of PEB. We could also designate board based on kind of those tiers, right? Because really the PEB board doesn't need to be involved in administrative stuff such as copiers and you know, janitorial bad examples that you're going to hear forever now, but we don't need to be involved with that level. But you know, I think that the other two levels where there is a lot more money spent, and it does have a material impact on rate setting and all of that, I do think personally that board members one or more board members should be on those contracts depending on the size.
Well, maybe we should have language that says something like, you know, instead of any number of members of the board may be appointed to the evaluation committee based on the, you know, sort of 3 categories that Mr. Lindley was talking about. a certain number of members, should be appointed to the evaluation committee. I mean,
No.
strongly encouraged to.
Bouncing off Michelle, maybe, administrative side, not required. Back of the house, strongly recommended. Front of the house, required.
And I also, just so it's Michelle again, I just also want to push back just generally on, it's been said a couple of times where board members didn't feel they had the expertise to be on an RFP. You don't really have to have a lot of expertise to evaluate these RFPs because you're comparing apples with apples, right? And so if you've got the ability to read and analyze and apply certain principles, you should be able to score an RFP even without having in-depth knowledge of, the network, for example. So I think maybe we can, when these matters are brought to the board, we can kind of encourage people because staff are the experts, right? And some of us, as Chair Freed mentioned, might have expertise from that's current, and some of us have expertise on different things from 20 years ago, and that's all really valuable. But I don't think you have to have that expertise to evaluate the RFPs. And so I guess I'd throw it, I'm interested to hear from Mr. Doty's opinion on that, about kind of the expert versus the non-expert people evaluating these RFPs.
Certainly, thank you for the question. It's true, we like people who have expertise and knowledge in the area, but some people are just good at serving the role of evaluator because they take the obligation seriously and they go through all the proposals and are very careful in what they do and may have experience as evaluators on other RFPs. And at this point, I should say how grateful I am to the people who serve as evaluators on evaluation committees, because our entire process depends upon state of Nevada employees taking on this extra time that they're not compensated for to serve as evaluators on these committees to make these decisions for the state in a way that is politically insulated and in a way that hopefully gets us the best vendor in each solicitation that we do.
Thank you.
Okay. Let's see. Subcommittee members, do we think we have given the PEB staff enough to go on to provide a draft red line of the policies and procedures? Well, maybe I should pose that question to PEB staff. Ms. Rich and Ms. Wayland, have we given you enough to go on?
I think so. I think we can take a good stab at it and bring it back to the full board, I believe, in January, unless you want to have another subcommittee meeting where we iron out the details before.
I think we do want to have another subcommittee meeting just because the corrective actions on either number 4 and number 5, I believe. The PEB board shall form a subcommittee, and then sub 2, once subcommittee recommendations have been approved by the board. Oh, okay. Well, yeah, I mean, we can make recommendations, but I would still like to see the subcommittee take action. Like, so, okay, yes, these are the recommendations for the full board. So I think we do need to have another subcommittee meeting. I know more meetings is just what everybody loves. Everybody's got time for that.
Keeping in mind, though, so a follow-up to the, I think, trying to think of the timing on this. I believe we have 6 months to carry it out. So I think we're okay. I was thinking March would be, that March board meeting would be too late to bring it back to the, we'd have to bring it to the January one, but I think the March would be okay. So
I did have another question too. We've talked a lot about the contract and it's a big project. So some of it to actually have everything completed in 6 months may not be realistic, but Laura, was there recommendations you needed about unnecessary spend money on awards and accreditation. We haven't touched that area or the edits to that. And it's because if we want to do this in the right way, it can't entirely be rushed. But I just thought I'd throw that out there too. Sorry, guys.
No, that's great. Thank you. You reminded me of something I was just about to forget. You're right. We haven't touched number 5. And, you know, I got to say, this one baffles me a little bit because clearly the audit was talking about the URAC accreditation, and then they were talking about the travel. And, you know, real quickly, going back to number 2, this one, you know, the proposed corrective action is PEB will coordinate with DHRM to ensure PEB policies and procedures are updated to reflect state gifting policies and ensure all employees sign updated attestations. Additionally, PEB will continue to request ethics training be provided to staff and board members on an annual basis. And we have done our annual training and we will continue to do so. So number 2, I'm not sure requires any guidance or recommendations to the full board from the subcommittee. But you're right, number 5 does. And I'm not entirely sure what LCB is looking for here. PEB will form a subcommittee with the purpose of creating criteria or guidelines to address 287-0434 regarding authorized expenditures to be met by staff before any proposed expenditures are brought to the board for consideration. Okay, does that mean please don't pursue URAC accreditation without asking the board? Or does that mean please don't pursue expenditures outside of the norm, whatever the norm is, before asking the board? And part of the reason I was going to have a second subcommittee meeting was because I wanted to ask subcommittee members to think about what they think expenditures, that is operating expenditures, not claims costs paid in the normal course of business. What kind of operating expenditures do you think are outside the norm that should be considered by the board? Because, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, some of it again may be subject matter expert things, because Medicaid would require our health plans as part of our RFPs, or we actually gave them extra points for being URAC accredited. And those were the health plans that we would release in our RFPs, and PEB being a health plan. Now, the auditors said no other public health plans have ever required it, but some of the stuff might be hard, because I think any of that could fall under administration of the program, and to actually identify whether it was wrong or right might be a matter of opinion. And maybe that's what you're trying to get at, Laura, is how we could identify it. But it might be something that the board should renew any new expenditures outside of scope, a new scope for PEB. And then if the managers did write why it was needed, at least the board could say it appeared to be a reasonable administrative expense because X, Y, and Z was written up, or we thought it wasn't because it looked more like a pretty bow on a package and wasn't needed. And so I'm wondering if it's any new administrative, again, we don't want to get into the weeds. So there you get the scope. So I know I'm rambling, but my point was, I'm not entirely convinced that URAC would have been totally unneeded, other than the fact that maybe other public entities didn't have it. But
just to piggyback on that, so it's Michelle for the record, I can see the auditor's point, and I think that sometimes when these things are not done or not discussed by the board, it gives the wrong appearance. So to me, some of these things just need to come to the board, not to second guess what staff want to do, but just as a check against our strategic direction, right? Because we shouldn't be spending money, taxpayers' money, employee money, on things that aren't strategically relevant to our plan and to providing the best health plan we can. And staff can do that evaluation as well as us, but it's harder for them to prove they did it if they didn't bring it to the board. And so for me, some like documenting those expenditures as opposed to running the office and supervising staff is really to help staff, stay focused on the strategic mission.
Michelle, I think that's what I was trying to say. I think you restated what I was trying to get out.
So this is Laura Rich. I believe, and I'd have to go back and check, but in the situation in the situation with URAC, that was actually brought to the board and approved by the board. The Stevie Awards, I do not think were. It was such a smaller dollar amount that it was not brought to the board. Those URAC awards were, or accreditation was brought to the board and approved by the board. So this is a situation where the auditors did not find that expense to be a legitimate expense by the program, but it had been approved by the board.
Hence, I think that whenever, so it's Michelle here, whenever stuff like that comes to the board, the minutes, maybe we need to do a good job of linking it to the strategic plan, right? So why are we doing this? This is the strategic plan. And, auditors are going to audit, right? Tim can, if they're going to come in and audit something, they're going to find issues. It's very rare that they don't. So really, in response, all we can do is make sure the records of meetings and are clearer as to why an expense is approved. Or if they really think that those kinds of awards don't add any value, then maybe the LCB needs to be clear about that and just say, don't spend any money on. But they didn't say that, right? So really, we just maybe need to tighten the records.
Michelle, I think that's an excellent point. If a new strategic initiative is brought to the board will, based on the strategic plan, or a new initiative is brought to the board will review, and it could be written in a policy to see if it's in line with the strategic plan and approved based on the strategic plan. I think that's an excellent point you just brought up, and that might be how the policy could be structured. I don't know.
So I guess what my recommendation would be just that we do maybe put a paragraph in about those, extra expenditures, having to add strategic value, come to the board, and then when we evaluate them next to this. We are very clear in our record, in the public records, that strategically this adds value to our mission because. Bullet point, bullet point, bullet point.
That is a very good suggestion. Thank you for making it. PEB staff, does that help? Okay.
So yes.
Okay. With that, I think maybe we've wrapped up what we can do today. So I will let PEB staff work on stuff for the rest of the calendar year, and we'll see if we can find some time in January. And I mean, if the stars align and we can have a subcommittee meeting in advance of the January board meeting, we might still make it, but we'll see what we can do, because I know we're heading into the session and we're heading into the end of the year when people take time off. And so I know this isn't going to be super easy to coordinate, but we'll do what we can do. Thank
Laura
you.
Freed, I do have one more quick question.
Yeah, of course.
Sorry, I keep interrupting.
No, your participation is valuable.
There was red lines and red additions to the policies that we haven't discussed, but I do know there was some input in the public comment, both verbally and the written submitted. So I don't know if that will be discussed if we have another meeting, or if that's just planned to go to the board meeting the way it is. Just a comment. I'm the one I know that said I had to end.
Okay. the executive officer, I think, is going to say the same thing as me, so I'll let her say it.
Okay. So this is Laura Rich. Yes, Betsy, the red lines in the document are actually red lines based on board decisions that were made earlier this year. And so those have not been brought back to the full board yet. The board decisions were made. The updates have then subsequently been made in the board policies and procedures, but it has not been brought back to the board yet for final approval, just because we knew that we had to make these additional changes as well. So that is where we stand on the changes to date. As far as other changes to the board policies and procedures, that can be placed on a future agenda if the board so chooses. But that is not something that we can discuss today.
Okay. With that, I think we have exhausted ourselves on agenda item 3. I will return to our second public comment period under agenda item 4 and turn it over to PEB staff.
Again, for those of you who called in during this period for public comment, the last 3 digits of the phone number will be announced and advise that the phone line has been unmuted, at which an audible message from Zoom will say that you are unmuted and press *6 to unmute. After the caller has unmuted themselves, they may proceed with their comments. Line ending in 837, your line has been unmuted.
Hi, this is Kent Irvin. Can you all hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Okay. For one thing, I know Marlene Lockhart was trying to get on at the earlier public comment, so maybe she's on now also. So Kent Irvin, ERVIN, Nevada Faculty Alliance. Since I was involved with the other public employee advocates on SB 502 in 2017, which placed the rules in 287.04345 on how PEB does these procurements, and also I'm a member of the Nevada Deferred Compensation Committee that has the same rules. I'd like to comment on some of the comments that have been made about that process. First of all, I don't believe that that section allows you to go into closed session to discuss the scope of an RFP prior to issuance. It's only about considering the evaluation committee results. It makes sense to do the RFP scope in an open public meeting. It may be very different if it's a RFP being prepared by staff only in an agency where, yes, it would be bad if one vendor got advanced knowledge of what's in the RFP, but when you have an open board, open meeting law board, doing that in an open meeting, then all vendors have equal opportunity to listen in and see what the board has to say about the RFP. And then when it eventually comes out, they'll see what's in the RFP just like everyone else. And then everything is confidential. As far as the closed meeting to consider the results of the evaluation committee, the intent of that is that the board at that point, after the proposals have been scored, there's only one finalist, and that's the only finalist that could go forward for contract negotiations. But that board, the board can evaluate in closed session, get some of the confidential details from the evaluation committee, and they might decide, for example, that, well, what we got back from this RFP, although there's a winning vendor, it just does not meet our needs. Maybe the scope was flawed. And in that case, they're allowed by the statute to cancel the RFP or modify the RFP and reissue it and start the whole process over. No, you would not want to do that unless it was really necessary, but it does give the board the possibility of doing that if it's necessary. One example I see where you might want to do that is, for example, there's a RFP out now for the provider network for the self-funded plan. And I believe there's also an RFP out for the HMOs, or it will go out soon. you might get pricing back for an HMO and decide that the board does not want to go forward with an HMO and substitute the EPO, for example. That would be a better deal. If you do that before the the notice of intent is issued, you would avoid negotiating a contract that in the end the board might disapprove later on. So it would make sense to have a closed meeting to discuss that, not put out any confidential details, but then an open meeting, make the decision, and it's just your choice of go with the letter of intent for the high scorer or start over the process. So that was the intent behind 287.04345, and I hope that provides some clarification. Thank you.
BJR, your line has been unmuted. Madam Chair, the public comment has been completed.
Okay. Well, with that, we are at the end of the meeting. I would like to thank everybody on this subcommittee for their active participation once again. You're honestly a terrific board, and the state is lucky to have you all. And I'd like to thank Mr. Doty for his expertise, as well as Ms. Mooneyhan for her legal way. And with that, we are adjourned. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.